First of all, I want to thank June and Tanya so much for organizing this. Let me start out by talking about a set of ideas about parenting, about relations between parents and children, that I talk about at much more length in my new book. And essentially, the idea behind the book is that our common conception of what relations between parents and children should be like, a conception that's captured by that word parenting, is a very, very peculiar and very recent one. And it's at odds in fairly profound ways with what we know about the scientific value of caregiving. And the sort of basic metaphor that drives the book, that's a way of trying to capture this, is that the picture that many, at least middle-class parents in America have of what parenting is about, is that being a parent's a bit like being a carpenter. So you have different kinds of material, but you have an outcome that you want, and if you just are expert enough, if you just have the right techniques, if you work well enough, if you have enough control, you'll end up getting a chair that's a good chair at the end of the process. So the idea is that you can end up with a good grown-up, a good adult as a result of this process of caregiving, the same way you end up with a good chair as a result of the process of carpentry. And what I want to suggest is that that's completely the wrong metaphor for describing what being a parent of a child is like. A much better metaphor is being a gardener. Now, if anyone here is actually a gardener, you know that being a gardener, for one thing, means a lot of hard work. So it's not like parents or gardeners don't matter to the garden. Gardeners are essential for the garden. And you spend a lot of your time up to your neck in manure. And you spend a lot of time sweating, you work very hard, and nothing comes out the way that you think it's going to come out or the way that you want it to come out. Everything always goes differently. The plants that you wanted so much to bloom in a particular place go someplace else. The beautiful manzanita tree gets rot on the other hand, the bulb that you completely forgot about shows up in exactly the right place. And the grapevine that was supposed to just stay on the arbor turns into the most wonderful feature of the garden because it takes over an entire fence. Now that's the phenomenology of being a gardener, but there's something that's more profound about that. And the more profound thought about being a gardener is that being a gardener is about creating an ecosystem. That's what really being a gardener is about. It's about creating a protected space in which many, many different varieties and possibilities can emerge. And that's why a garden is a living thing. A garden is something that changes. A garden is something that varies. A garden is something that will adjust to different kinds of environmental circumstances. And the really interesting thing about being a gardener is that you can create a space, a place, you can do things that will allow that kind of robust, variable ecosystem to thrive. So what you do when you're a gardener is try to create a space in which all sorts of new things will happen that you couldn't possibly have predicted beforehand, and also create a space that's robust enough so that when there's rain or when there's drought or when things change, something in the garden is going to bloom and prosper. And that's really what gardening is about. And what I want to argue is that that's what being a parent is about. That's what being a parent is about from an evolutionary perspective, and that's what being a parent is about from a developmental perspective. So almost by definition, if you're a good parent, you won't know how your children are going to turn out. And this is a deeper and perhaps more difficult piece. If there isn't some risk that everything goes wrong, then you haven't done it right. It seems like a strange thing to say, but I think that's true about most of the deep, profound things that we do as human beings. So let me say some more about this. So as I said, there's this very strange thing that happened to parents and children just about, in fact, we can kind of date it. It was just at the end of the 20th century. And this strange thing was called parenting. So, of course, there have been mothers and fathers and parents as long as there have been human beings. But the word parenting as a verb actually shows up for the first time in 1970 in Merriam-Webster. No one had ever used it as a verb before then. And I think there was a reason why suddenly parent went from being a relationship to being a verb. And the reason was that for the first time in human history, people were caring for children who had never cared for children before. So as we'll see in a moment, the kind of model, the evolutionary model for caring for children is that older siblings, for example, are deeply involved in the care of younger siblings. So for most of human history, by the time you were having children yourself, say you were 18 or 19, not only had you yourself taken care of lots of children, but you had watched many, many different people taking care of many different children. And the strange thing that happened at the end of the 20th century was that for the first time in history, you had people who had spent, say, 30 or 40 years working and going to school and had never taken care of a child. So if you spend 35 years working and going to school and you have a child and you've never taken care of a child and you've never seen other people taking care of a child, except maybe for your experience of your own caregiving, which of course is notoriously completely distorted and you have no idea about, you might think that taking care of children is a subcategory of working and going to school. And we all know how working and going to school go, right? Working and going to school are like being a carpenter. There's goals that you set, there's benchmarks that you have, there's expertise that you acquire. You can say whether you're a good writer or a good professor or a good scientist or a good builder. That is a very clear model of a particular kind of adult grown-up activity. And you can measure it, you can think of outcomes, you can work to improve it, you can get expertise that will improve it. Those are all the things that we do when we work and go to school. So I think what happened was that parents were, first of all, raising children for the first time largely by themselves, and they were doing it after they'd spent all this time working and going to school. This is a New Yorker cartoon that kind of captures the nouveau model of parenting. And, there's people will talk in a kind of dismissive tone about helicopter parents and so forth. But I think this is much deeper than just helicopter parents. I think if you go out into the world at large, this model of if I do certain things when my child is young, then my child will turn into an adult with certain kinds of features later on. It's completely, completely pervasive in the culture. So as a developmental psychologist, I cannot think of ever doing a public interview where someone didn't ask me at the end, and talking about all the wonderful work that we developmental psychologists have done about how much children learn and how much they know, where someone didn't ask the question, well, does that mean that if we do X, that when they're 40, they're going to be Y? Or the number of parents who come up and say, oh, does this mean that he's going to tell his therapist about me? Ha ha ha. Or, that model is deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained in the culture. So if that's not the right model, what's the model that comes out of science? What can we say about an alternative model? Now, if you think about that parenting model from the perspective of evolution, it's pretty weird, right? So if it was so great to be a grown-up with particular features, why not just design grown-ups to have those features? So why would it be that you would have this incredible, intentional, rational, hard-won expertise to come up with an adult who had the features that you want when you could have just built that into the adult? And this is a particularly interesting problem because one of the things that's most distinctive about human beings, quite possibly the most distinctive things about human beings from an evolutionary perspective, is that we have this very, very, very extended childhood, much, much longer than the childhood of any other species. This is a chimp. By the time this is a five-year-old chimp, Gremlin. By the time Gremlin was 5, he was producing as much food as he was consuming. And that's true about 5-year-old chimps, our closest primate relatives in general. Even among forager cultures, which is, by the way, the right description for what we used to call hunter-gatherers, because it turns out most of the actual food is coming from the gatherers and not from the hunters. Even in forager cultures, children are not producing as much as they're consuming until they're 15. And in contemporary cultures, my son is 27, and there can still be a long gap. And even in forager cultures, 15 is kind of the youngest when you find people producing as much as they're consuming. So that's a big, big gap. And for once, this is when you start talking about the evolutionary bases of psychology, it's tempting to tell just those stories, as we all know. But this is something where we actually have the kind of evidence from things like behavioral ecology and evolutionary biology that goes way beyond the kind of just so stories you typically hear in evolutionary psychology. And here's one such piece of evidence, for example. You can actually use dental records to look at what the period of childhood was in fossils, literally across human evolution. So it's not just comparing us to our closest primate relatives. We can go back to the fossils and see when did they lose their baby teeth and get their grown-up teeth. And when we do that, we can see that even comparing our close relatives like Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals were maturing more quickly than we were. And if you look at Homo erectus and so forth, you can really track just in that, just literally during the period when we evolved, you can track that childhood getting longer and longer. It turns out that there's this puzzle. Why do we have this extended childhood? Why is it so distinctive? Why was it clearly the thing that changed during the course of our evolution? And again, what behavioral ecologists can do is look at many, many different species, not just human beings, and try and see if you can find evolutionary generalizations about features of particular species. And one of the really clear evolutionary generalizations is that a longer childhood is correlated with a larger brain and a generally smarter and more flexible adult animal. And in fact, the original animals that where this relationship was found weren't even mammals, they were birds. This is a New Caledonian crow, incredibly smart animal. Crows and corvids are as smart as chimpanzees, learned how to make this hook. This is our friend, the domestic chicken, and with apologies to any chicken lovers in the audience, which are likely to be here in Berkeley. Chickens are dumb as stumps, basically. They're very good at pecking for grain. They're not very good at doing anything else. And the really striking divisions, I'll get back to this point later on, the really striking differences are differences about learning. So actually it's interesting, there's nativist child development people who argue for a lot of innate structure, often point to studies of chickens that show that chickens actually have a tremendous amount of cognitive structure in place from the time they're born. But that should be a sign that that's why chickens are so dumb. Chickens are so dumb in the sense that they know a lot about very specific things, and a lot of those computations are in place literally from the time the chickens are born. The crows don't start out knowing as much, but they're much better at learning, to the point where they can, for instance, go into a lab, see a wire that they've never seen before, and figure out how to use it to make a hook tool. Now, this, as I said, this early childhood is extremely costly. It's extremely costly metabolically to begin with. So look at the bottom two, if you look at the bottom two slides there, a beautiful statistic that I really love that came out recently is that you may know that your brain is an incredibly hungry organ. So just when you're just sitting here now, your brain's using up 20% of your calories just when you're sitting here thinking. It always seemed to me like, those of us who use our brains really well should not have to go and exercise and diet, but it doesn't seem to work that way. It's just your brain working. How well it's working is kind of beside the point. So what happened, just this is a 2014 paper, how does that happen? How does that change over development? And it turns out that the absolute peak glucose use by the brain is about 4 years old. So what happens is that when you're about 4 years old, 66% of your calories are going to your brain. And in fact, part of what happens with the extended childhood is that growth slows down in that period, about 4 or 5, to compensate for the fact that all of these calories are going to babies' brains. And then you gradually, we might not say get stupider, although we will a bit later on, gradually your brain is using fewer and fewer calories. So my vision is this actually fits if you know Augie. My grandson, Augie is basically like this creature out of Doctor Who with his giant brain, this giant hungry brain, and this little skinny body that's just basically designed to move his brain around and turn his grandmother into his slave without her really knowing about it. So this long childhood is really costly, and particularly the costly part of it seems to be that those brains are so hungry and need to have so much activity during this period. And the costliness comes with another feature that comes out of real evolutionary biology, which is, I said before, there's a strong correlation between brain size and learning ability and childhood. And not too surprisingly, there's also a correlation with how much parental investment there is. So the cost of this long childhood, this hungry brain, is that you need someone to take care of you during that period of childhood. And in fact, when you look across, for example, this is one of my favorite studies. This is a study of marsupials. Again, very different creatures than we are. You see this very general correlation across all the creatures that we can think of between the size of the brain of the adults and the degree of parental investment. So for example, this is the world's cutest animal. This is a little marsupial, a quokka, that lives on an island in Australia. This is a Virginia opossum, which is another marsupial. They're just about the same size. The quokka babies stay in the pouch for a year, and both the males and the females perform parental investment and care. So the quokkas have one baby at a time, the baby stays in the pouch for a long time, and both mothers and fathers take care of the baby. In contrast, if you look at the Virginia possum, now I have to say, I think most of us mothers generally feel more like the possum in that picture than like the beautiful quokka with the sun coming from behind. The possums, in comparison, have large litters, 8 or 9 babies at a time. And only the mother is involved in caregiving, and the possum babies are mature within a couple of months. And the quokka babies have brains that are the adult quokkas have brains that are twice as big as the possum babies. I should say, if those of you here probably know Lucy Jacobs, our colleague who studies comparative cognition. And Lucy, like many comparative cognition people, there's not an animal in the world that Lucy doesn't love. Lucy will tell you about how incredibly intelligent, like jumping spiders, they are so brilliant, and bees and wolves, my goodness, you just couldn't imagine how smart wolves are. And I very tentatively talked to her about this, and she said, possums are really stupid. Possums, I've raised possums. She said, possums are, they are stupid. There is no question. Okay. So this scheme, the hungry brain, the long period of immaturity, goes with having to have a lot more caregiving investment. And when you look again at the real, at some real behavioral ecology about human beings, what you see is that if you compare us to our closest primate relatives, we really differ in quite a drastic way on this dimension of caregiving. And in fact, we have what I call the triple threat. We have more parental investment, more caregiving investment, just built into our biology than any other creature. So if you compare us to our closest relatives, chimpanzees, for example, essentially what happens is that mother chimpanzees take care of baby chimpanzees. The babies are held very closely to the mom's chest, and the moms are doing almost all of the caregiving, and the moms, in fact, won't let other people get near the babies. If you compare that to human beings, the first part of the triple threat is that we have pair bonding. So we actually have paternal care. So we have males who are bonding with females and being involved in paternal care. Now, again, we just sort of take that for granted, but fewer than 5% of all mammals have pair bonding. And among the great apes, only gibbons are pair bonded, not any of our other close relatives. So pair bonding is actually extremely unusual in the animal kingdom. There's more of it among birds, where there's also a lot of paternal investment, but it's very rare among mammals, and it really differentiates us from our closest relatives. And again, it turns out that when you actually look carefully at the biology, even looking at the fossil record, you can see that pair bonding was something that evolved in the period when Homo sapiens evolved. The details of this may be a little a little disturbing, but basically the story is that when you look at pair bonded species, you see some very characteristic biological changes. So in pair bonded species, there's less of a size difference between males and females. And they also have smaller bowls. So lower testicle size and lower levels of testosterone. That's the slightly disturbing part, which you might or might not want to tell the partners who were in the other room. And when you actually look at even the fossil record, you can see that when you look at things like relative finger length, which is a marker of testosterone, that pair bonding was something that was, and you look at these things like relative size, you compare chimpanzee testicles to human testicles, you see all these signs that pair bonding was a very distinctive part of our human evolution. And that, by the way, is my son and my grandson. And there's very good evidence that when you see pair bonding across the animal kingdom, including among the birds where it's pervasive, what you see is a correlation between pair bonding and paternal investment. So where you see pair bonding is when you see needy babies who need to be taken care of by more than one person. We also have another part, the second part of the triple threat, which is this is a wonderful book that I highly recommend by Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, which is something called alloparents. So I mentioned that among our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, for example, mothers are just taking care of babies. But if you look a little further afield among other kinds of primates, for example, you see that lemurs and langurs actually have non-kin who are involved in taking care of babies. So again, it's unusual adaptation, but you can find it even among other prosimians, where, even among other monkeys, where non-kin are actually involved in caregiving. And as with evolution, with caregiving itself, this is kind of evolutionary paradox. Why is it that even when you're not, you don't have a genetic relationship to a baby, you would be investing in caring for the baby? And I can talk some more about what the biologists think about that. But one thing that's very clear is that, again, from the time we evolved, human beings used this alloparenting strategy. There's a beautiful study by Barry Hewlett that just came out, where he actually just looked at who breastfeeds babies in forager societies. And he discovered that babies were typically breastfed by 4 or 5 different people in the course of a month, including grandmothers, who we'll get to in a minute. So if you look in forager societies, what's happening is that even non-kin are taking care of babies. And the story seems to be, for one thing, we are relatively closely genetically related because we're matrilocal, which is something I'll get to later on. And that caregiving serves as a kind of form of reciprocal altruism in situations where babies are very needy. If I take care of your baby, then you'll take care of mine. And it also serves as an opportunity for learning. So one of the things that we know is that primiparous mothers of all sorts, including humans and chimps and apes, tend to have difficulty raising their babies. And having had the experience of caring for another baby, sort of the equivalent of the teenage babysitter, actually makes those young mothers better when it comes time to actually take care of their own babies. So we have good evidence for alloparents, and this is the old idea about it's taking a village from an evolutionary perspective. That's kind of like why we have villages. It's not just that it takes the village to have the child. It's like the reason why we developed the villages, so it was so that we could take care of the children. And Sarah Hrdy's made the argument, which I think is actually a very good one. We often talk about the development of other typical human characteristics like reciprocal altruism, like cooperation, seem to be very distinctive human characteristics. Amazingly enough, the context in which these are usually described is going out and doing things like hunting for large animals. It turns out hunting for large animals does almost nothing for the calorie count of most hunter-gatherer groups. It's not actually a good source of meat. I mean, it's kind of like treats. You get steaks, but if you're looking at what actually is keeping most of the people alive, it's things like digging for roots. So it seems unlikely that it was actually hunting that did that. I was talking about this with Susan Carey, who's another senior woman of my generation, and we were sort of saying, well, why are they hunting if it's not actually, it's so much work and they're not bringing back a lot of calories? And we both sort of decided, you know what it is? It's the grandmothers are sitting there digging the roots, and they find themselves saying, honey, why don't you go and find a mastodon, right? Like, don't give me advice about how to do the roots. I know how to dig the roots, find myself. Just go out and find a nice mastodon. That would be really good. We would really like to have that for dinner, dear. But if you think about the cooperative demands of raising children, and this conference is a perfectly beautiful example of that. That demands incredible amounts of cooperation and coordination if you're going to have a whole community of alloparents who are trying to swap out who's taking care of who's doing this other kind of work, who's doing the foraging, who's taking care of the children. And Sarah's suggested that it was that cooperative breeding, as it's unromantically called, that was actually the thing that was the trigger for things like theory of mind and reciprocal altruism and cooperation in human beings. Okay, the last and my favorite part of the triple threat, if you look carefully behind those three incredibly beautiful children, you can see that there's a grandmother hiding in the background. And the third part of the triple threat is grandmothers. And human beings are are the only creatures, except killer whales, the only animals that we know of where the females actually outlive their fertility. And you might think, okay, well, that's because of modern medical care. It turns out that if you look at forager cultures, females are outliving their fertility too. We talk about a low life expectancy, but the low life expectancy is because babies are dying. If you make it past 40 in these forager cultures, you're very likely to make it to, say, 60 or 70. And conversely, if you look at, again, our closest relatives, like chimpanzees, even in situations where they're in a sanctuary with lots of medical care, female chimpanzees are dying when they're 50, and they're not outliving their fertility. So this is, again, one of these evolutionary puzzles. Why is it that we have females who are sticking around for 20 years after they're no longer carrying on their own genes directly? And the great anthropologist Christian Hawkes has made really beautiful, rigorous studies showing that grandmother contribution, especially to things like caregiving, is actually what makes the difference to a human society being able to continue, in particular to taking care of these babies. So if you look at one of the things that's characteristic about us, as I said, is we have this long period of immaturity. But not only do we have this long period of immaturity, but that long period of immaturity actually is associated with shorter interbirth intervals. So we have babies in the wild, as it were, about once every 2 years. Chimps have babies only once every 5 years. So not only do we have these needy babies, but we kind of stack up the needy babies. And one of the things that Sarah discovered was that if you want to predict the welfare of a newborn, or even a 6-month-old infant, that depends on how many resources the mother has. But the welfare of the 2.5-year-old, whose mother now has a new baby, depends on how many resources the grandmother has. So the grandmothers seem to be kind of stepping in with the 2.5-year-olds and providing care. And again, just looking at these behavioral ecologists are insane. You know, they spend like months counting every single calorie in this group, who produced it and who consumed it. And if you just look at who's producing the calories, those grandmothers are literally crucial for the survival of the community, and in particular crucial for the survival of the babies. And Kristen's done some very nice modeling about how this kind of grandmother property could have evolved. Okay, so what we have is we have a lot of evidence that caregiving is crucial to human thriving, but that caregiving does not take the form of a person who's the designated parent who does a bunch of things that are called parenting to make the child come out. Instead, what caregiving does is have the form of changing the entire structure of the species, so that essentially everybody in the species is designed to be engaged in caregiving for all the children, or at least all the children in the immediate vicinity. Now, why, again, but so far I've just talked about this, but I haven't talked about, the real puzzle, which is why, okay? So why would we have this incredibly long period of immaturity and then have all these adaptations, all this energy, all this investment in just taking care of these babies? And again, when you look at real evolutionary psychology, there may be a clue. So what was the thing that actually was the trigger for human beings evolving? And increasingly what anthropologists and biologists think is that the striking thing was that the environment became much more uncertain and variable. And this is a kind of marvelous slide. It's a little counterintuitive. I don't know why they set it up this way. This is early going to late, where they actually looked at the degrees of oxygen isotopes, which turn out to be a measure of climate, of temperature. And what you can see is that in the period of human evolution, it wasn't that things got a little colder, but more importantly, they got much less predictable. So this shows you the range of cold to hot temperatures over a period of years. And what happened was that the environment got much less predictable and much more variable. And if you combine that with the fact that human beings were nomadic from the very beginning, unlike our closest primate relatives, that means that we were really designed to be dealing with unpredictable, variable kinds of environments. That seems to have been the thing that led to our distinctive human adaptations. Now, if you go back to the crows and the chickens, you can see why a learning strategy, a strategy that involves this large brain that's good at going out in the world and learning, would be a good strategy for dealing with that kind of environmental variability and unpredictability. So whereas those chicks, literally from the time they're born, have all the grain pecking stuff in there, they're great in a grain pecking environment. If suddenly the environment changes, they're not going to be able to cope. Whereas with the crows, the environment changes, suddenly there's wires. The crow can figure out how to solve those problems. But that strategy comes with a cost. So the relevant difference here is that these crows are fledglings for as long as a year, and the New Caledonian crows are fledglings for as long as 2 years, whereas the chickens are mature within a couple of months. So what's happening in that 2 years when those New Caledonian crows are fledglings? Well, it turns out that in the wild, the animals are using these tool-using abilities to, it's sort of amazing things. They take these pandanus palm leaves, and then they strip off the leaves, and then they leave little barbs, and then they nibble the tip until it's a really sharp point, and then they take the leaf with their beak, they go to a termite hole, they agitate the termites, and then they pull it out, and they have this termite shish kebab. It's an incredible bit of tool use. So when you actually watch the babies, what the babies are doing, and again, this will be no surprise to any parents in the audience, they're screwing it up. So basically what they do is they try to do it, they do the barbs on the wrong side, they try and get it by the thin end instead of the thick end, and it takes them 2 years to figure out how to do this. So the point is, when you're using this learning mechanism, the essential thing about learning is trying different things and failing. So it's generating lots of possibilities and then having some of those possibilities be successful and some of those possibilities fail. That's what you have to do to actually be able to learn. The trouble is if you're in this mode of generating lots of possibilities, trying things out and failing, you don't get any termites. And essentially what happens is the mother crows are kind of, standing there, tapping their feet and dropping termites into the babies' mouths while the babies are trying to figure this out. So a way of, one way of thinking about this is that that comes out of the computational literature, is that there's a tension between two ways that you could be dealing with the environment, exploring versus exploiting. So if you're exploring, that's a very good technique for learning. That's what those baby crows are doing. Again, generating lots of variability, generating lots of possibilities, especially when you don't know what your environment is going to be like, and learning about the environment. The trouble is that there's an intrinsic tension between doing that kind of wide-ranging exploration, generating a lot of new hypotheses, generating a lot of new solutions to a problem, and actually solving the problem as quickly and effectively as you possibly can. And the argument that I've made is that childhood reflects this trade-off between exploring and exploiting. So you can think about children as being like the R&D division of the human species, and we're like production and marketing. So they get a protected period in which all they have to do is generate new possibilities, do all sorts of things, do things that they may not even have seen anybody do before, try out all sorts of possibilities. Most possibilities will fail. That's what possibilities are all about. And during that period when most possibility is failing, we can take advantage of the learning that we did ourselves as children to support the new generation of children. And that's a basic argument that I want to make about caregiving. And you can actually see this strategy if you look at human brain development. So what you see is that across all animals, but strikingly across human beings, we have this early period when many, many new neural connections, new synapses are being formed. And then we have a later period where the synapses that are used a lot become strengthened, become myelinated, and the other connections get pruned. So we seem to have this, even from a neurological perspective, we have this kind of shift from an early system, and notice that this is the preschool years, the years when the babies are most completely dependent, of an early system that's very well designed for exploring new possibilities, right? Literally making new kinds of neural connections based on environmental input. Not very good at doing anything in particular. Not very good at, getting shoes on or getting a snowsuit on. And then we have this later system, which is the adult system, which is very much a lean, mean machine, very good at doing things, not as good at plasticity, not as good at shifting in those shifting environmental conditions, which seem to have been the trigger for actually human evolution. Okay. So if all of that is true, then we ought to see some of these differences in learning mechanisms in the course of development. And that's where everything I've talked about so far is not my work, but talking about other people's work. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about our own work in the lab that suggests that a pattern that's like this. So essentially what we found, so if this kind of evolutionary strategy that I've talked about, which is that children are about exploring unlikely possibilities and learning new things about the environment that the previous generation might not have known or might not have discovered, then we might expect to see this in children's learning as well. And over the last 30 years or so, my collaborators and I have been, and many other people in developmental psychology, have indeed shown that even the very youngest children have really striking, remarkable learning capacities. Even infants can already extract structure from statistical patterns, can essentially do intuitive experiments and so forth. That's been a big discovery in developmental psychology in the last 15 years. But in some work that we've been doing more recently, we've discovered, sort of stumbled on a really interesting pattern, which is that in some circumstances, the children are actually better at doing this kind of learning than adults are. And I think the circumstances in which they're better reflect this explore-exploit kind of trade-off. So this is work with Chris Lucas and Tom Griffith. What we've done to try and see how children learn is use this very simple little device. It's the Blicket detector. Some people, Blicket detector is a little box that lights up and plays music when you put some things on it, but not others. And your job is to figure out which ones are Blickets and to figure out how to make the machine go. Now, some of you in this room will know the answer to this, so just hush, but we can do the experiment with the people in this room. So here's the pattern that you see, for instance. You see that one block D, in practice, these are different shapes, goes on the detector and nothing happens 3 times in a row. E goes on the detector, nothing happens. D and F together go on the detector, and the detector lights up. And the question is D a Blicket? Okay. Is E a Blicket? Is F a Blicket? Okay, great. So everyone here is as smart as Berkeley undergraduates, but not as smart as a 4-year-old, because what if you also saw this sequence of events? So first you saw that each individual object makes the machine go, a combination like A and C makes the machine go, the other combinations don't make the machine go. Now you might think, oh, wait a minute, I thought it was individual blocks either made it go or not. Maybe the principle is that this works in this kind of weird way where you have to have a combination of blocks to make it go. And if that was the case, and now you went back to that original sequence, you might say, oh no, wait a minute, maybe if this machine works on that same general weird principle, then D and F together might make it go. So what you've got is a trade-off between 2 initial hypotheses, the individual one, for which you've had a lot of evidence, which is a sort of obvious one, versus this combination one, which is sort of weird and strange and you wouldn't get to as easily, but which actually fits with the data that you've seen. Sorry, I should say what we do. So what we do is we either give people examples of this or relationship, which is kind of the obvious one, or we give them examples of the and relationship, just like you just did, and then we give them exactly the same ambiguous sequence of events that you just saw. And let's see. I'll give you a few minutes of cute baby video because that's a moral obligation of developmental.
It's very important, again, for us to figure out which of these are blickets. So let's call this one triangle, okay? What should we call this one?
Square.
Square. And what should we call this one?
Ball.
Ball. Sounds good. Okay, so let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine. Are you ready? Let's see. Look at that. The machine did not turn on. Let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine again, okay? Look, the machine did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle on the machine one more time, okay? Let's see. Look, the machine did not turn on. Now let's see what happens when we put square on the machine, okay? Look at that. The machine did not turn on. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle and ball on the machine together. Look at that! The machine turned on. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle, square, and ball all on the machine together. Are you ready? Let's see. Look at that! The machine turned on. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we put triangle and ball on the machine together. You ready? Let's see. Look! The machine turned on! So Scarlett, do you think that triangle is a blicket or not a blicket? A blicket. And do you think that square is a blicket or not a blicket?
No.
No. And do you think that ball is a blicket or not a blicket?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Scarlett, which of these should we use to make my machine turn on? Those two?
Okay, so this is a child in the and condition. I like showing this because, as I say, we have a moral obligation to show cute child videos, but also because whenever I show this to an adult audience, I can see this look of unease on everyone's face because they're saying to themselves, is it just me? I have no idea what just happened there. Was it like the square one or was it the circle one? But that little 4-year-old, little girl, is watching and tracking that very complicated pattern of evidence. And in fact, what we did was test this, as I said, with 4-year-olds and Berkeley undergraduates. And what you can see, you can see the joke, right? The children are saying that both D and F are blickets in the and condition, not in the control or condition. In the or condition, they both look exactly alike, so it isn't just that they're always saying yes. And the adults are still sticking to their initial hypothesis. So the adults in that circumstance look at it and say, I have no idea what's going on. Let's just must just be the individual. It must just be the individual objects, which is what I thought beforehand. And you can see this also when we say, what can you make the machine go? Again, the children are choosing multiple combinations of multiple objects. Interestingly, often not just D and F, they'll try like D and E or another combination, but they're using combinations. And the adults are being somewhat sensitive to the data, so they're not completely insensitive to the data, but they're much less sensitive to the data than the children are in this particular unlikely combination. And the interesting thing is, sorry, I'll show this. So what we've done most recently, this is work that's just fresh, hot off the press. Some of you here are interested in adolescents. Is this just something about, our undergraduates are too distracted to do anything? So what we did, this is work with Sean O'Grady, what we did was actually track this across development. And what came out was very interesting. And in some ways, we didn't quite expect this. So here are the 3 and 4-year-olds. Here are 6 and 7-year-olds, 9 to 11-year-olds, 12 to 14-year-olds, in other words, adolescents and adults. And what you can see is that there it doesn't seem to be a continuous developmental change. Instead, what seems to happen is there's two kind of tipping points, sort of not surprisingly in some ways connected to two periods that we know are big periods of developmental change. One is the transition from preschool to school age, and the school age children are somewhat less likely to choose the unlikely alternative than the preschoolers are. But the big transition actually comes in adolescence. So if you look at the adolescents and adults actually aren't statistically significant, significantly different from one another statistically. And you can see this even more clearly if you look at the intervention results when we actually ask the adults and children to make the machine go, where the 12 to 14-year-olds, the adolescents, are even more conservative than the adults are. So it looks as if there's a big, it looks as if it may not just be that what's happening is you're gradually accumulating more and more knowledge as you get older. It looks as if there might really be a difference in the way first school-age children and then adolescents approach this problem. And if you go back to thinking about that brain development chart, one of the things that we know is that there's big changes and big increases in pruning during adolescence, even biologically. And as I say, we found this in this experiment, and the kind of nice scientific story is that we just had started out not looking for this pattern. What we started out doing was just thinking, could we show that even young children could understand unlikely general principles about how the machine worked? That was the sort of initial thing we wanted. We didn't think we would find a developmental difference. We would have been surprised if children could have done this at all. So we now have 3 or 4 different studies, which we started out doing just seeing could children figure these things out, in which we get this pattern where not only can the children figure it out, but they're better at doing it than adolescents or older children. I'll just mention in passing, an interesting thing about the adolescents is we have another task that's like this, but is a social task about inferring traits versus situations. On that one, the adolescents are actually more plastic and flexible than the school-age children or the adults. So it isn't just that the adolescents are getting less flexible, it seems to be relative to particular domains, but I can talk about that later on. And let me talk finally about some experiments about, so what this is showing is that the children are exploring the space of hypotheses, the space of possibilities, much more widely than the adults are. And this seems to be sort of biologically built, at least the hypothesis, this may be biologically built into what it means to be a child. And that could help explain why we actually have this extended period of childhood. So the thought is that the extended period of childhood is really biologically designed to give us creatures who are very good at exploring the space of possibilities and learning new possibilities, given that they may just be plunked into this environment which is different from the environment of the previous generation. Now, in terms of caregiving, so one thing that the caregivers are doing is nurturing and keeping these children going, but it turns out that they're not just keeping the children alive. Caregivers are actually giving the children the information that they need to be able to make these new discoveries. And there's a big, wonderful literature that's shown that. But what's important to say is that from the children's perspective, when you say that caregivers are giving information, the way that we think in the parenting model of caregivers giving children information is that they're doing something like teaching. And teaching, as it's typically seen, is kind of like carpentry, right? You know, there's a particular outcome we want. We want the children to know a particular thing. We want them to develop certain skills, score a particular way on a test. And we think that if we just do the right things to the children, then they'll come out the way that we want them to. And in fact, what the data have shown is that although children are learning from what adults are doing, they're doing it in a way that looks very different from teaching. And this will be the last experiment. This is an experiment we did with Daphne Buxbaum. What we did was we showed the children these musical toys, and there were different things you could do to them. You could squeeze them, you could shake them, you could pull the ring. And the children saw 3 actions in a row. The adult demonstrated 3 actions in a row, and then went to see which, then just gave them to the children to imitate. And the interesting thing was that the statistical patterns of those 3 actions suggested different causal structures. So for example, if you see this statistical pattern, you see 3 in a row, and B and C always are at the end, and those are the ones that actually make the machine go, make the machine light up and play music. If you were making a rational inference, you might infer, oh, maybe it's just B and C. Maybe I don't really need to do these other things. In this condition, you might infer, oh, maybe it's just C. In this condition, you might infer, oh, in that case, you actually do have to do A and B and C. And we did a sort of formal model showing this. Now, notice that all of these are possible, but in each case, all of the options are possible, but BC is more probable in this case, and ABC is more probable in this case, and C is more probable in this case. So what we did was we just showed 4-year-olds these patterns of action, and here is a 4-year-old in this experiment.
Isn't it crazy? Yeah, I've never played with it before. So you know what's funny about it? It plays music. But I don't know how to make it play music yet, so I thought that what we could do is we could try some things and see if we can figure it out, okay? You want to help me see if we can figure out what makes it go? Alright, so that's going to be our game. We'll see what makes my new toy play music. What should I try? Alright, well, what if I squish it, and then I squeeze it here, and then I pull this ring. Oh! Play music! Should I try that again? Alright. I'll squish it. And then I'll squeeze it here. And then I'll pull this ring. Yay! I think I should try something else. I'll try something else. What if I squish it? And then I shake it. And then I pull this ring. Do you hear anything? No, I don't hear anything either.
Okay, she goes on and does this 5 more times. And again, this is one of those ones where you may be having a hard time tracking it. This is the BC condition.
Want to try and make it go? Why don't you make it go? Oh, good job!
So what happened was the children produced the sub-combination. Even though they'd always seen all 3, they produced the sub-combination that was actually the rational combination to make things go. So even though they were seeing the adult demonstrating all of these actions, the children were combining the adult demonstration with their ability to infer the data to create a new possibility which they had not actually seen demonstrated, create a new way of solving this problem. Now here's the final Here's the final kicker. As you can see, Daphna, who is a computer science graduate at MIT, was very good at looking completely clueless, and she was looking clueless in this experiment. We did the same experiment, exactly the same, except that now Daphna comes in and says, "This is my toy. I'm going to show you how my toy works." When we did that, all the children ever did was imitate exactly what the experimenter did. And this fits with a lot of other experiments that show that children are sensitive to this kind of pedagogical information. So when the children got information that suggested that they should narrow their search just to fit the adult, the children were very capable of doing that. But the consequence of that was, in a way, what that was doing was turning the children into adults prematurely. It was what pedagogy does is get you very quickly to that right adult solution. What it doesn't do is give you the option of exploring the wide range of learning possibilities that are ahead of you. Okay, so let me finish up, since we have children knocking at the door, by saying, so what's the point of caregiving? If parenting is sort of the wrong model, I think the combination of both the evolution and the development suggests this really different model about what caregiving is about. So the model is that what caregivers are doing is they're first providing this safe, protected space in which resources are available and you can explore. And then the second thing they're doing is they're providing data. So they're giving children lots and lots and lots of information. But the combination of that, giving lots of information, giving lots of data, letting children observe, and giving them this safe space, is not that what comes out at the end is a child with a particular set of beliefs or a particular set of hypotheses or a particular set of strategies or a particular set of personality traits. So what comes out is this range, both within a particular individual child and across children, this wide range of hypotheses and solutions and skills and personality types. So what comes out is a garden. What comes out is an ecosystem that's variable, that's all over the place, that's unpredictable, that you could never have anticipated beforehand, but that is also robust to novelty, to change, to new circumstances. So that's a picture of caregiving that makes caregiving absolutely crucial. It's not that parents don't matter. Parents matter incredibly, but they matter exactly because they can't predict how the children are going to turn out. They matter exactly because the things that they do are going to come out with outcomes that are unpredictable. So let me just end with an image. I think one of the sad things about being a parent, captured in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, is that you're always watching the past recede behind you. You're always watching your parents and your grandparents and even your young children just kind of disappearing into the past. And the more you try and look back and keep them, the less effective you're going to be. But I think there's also a kind of optimistic version of the Orpheus myth, which is that we're also watching our children go off into the future. So especially being a grandmother, what you're watching is children who are going to be in new places, in new environments, are going to be totally unlike anything that you could have predicted. And that's really the triumph of being a caregiver.